answer. Now, David Cameron goes to Brussels later this week to meet other EU leaders. It's a crucial meeting for the Prime Minister as he tries to secure a new deal for the UK ahead of the promised in-out referendum on our EU membership. So what's Mr Cameron after? The 4-year wait on EU migrants seeking in-work benefits for 4 years has been seen as the real demand of substance in the Prime Minister's renegotiation strategy and a Conservative manifesto promise. But it was also a major sticking point for the rest of the EU. In a letter last week, EU Commission President Donald Tusk described it as delicate, and Poland declared it a red line issue. Some Sunday papers appeared to have been briefed that the Prime Minister was now willing to compromise on the issue, for example, by requiring UK as well as EU citizens to pay national insurance contributions for 4 years before they can claim in-work benefits. But last night, a Downing Street spokesman briefed the proposal that is on the table is the 4-year benefit delay one. That's the basis of our renegotiation. Anything else is speculation. David Cameron is due to discuss the issue with other leaders at the EU summit on Thursday. But there has already been angry reaction from some Tory MPs who remember the Prime Minister's speech in autumn 2014, which placed cutting EU migration at the centre of his strategy.
EU migrants should have a job offer before they come here. UK taxpayers will not support them if they don't. And once they're in work, they won't get benefits or social housing from Britain unless they've been here for at least 4 years. Yes, these are radical reforms, but they are also reasonable and fair. And the British people need to know that changes to welfare, to cut EU migration, they will be an absolute requirement in the negotiation that I'm going to undertake. I'm confident that they will reduce significantly EU migration to the UK, and that is what I'm determined to deliver.
David Cameron. Well, we're joined now by our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth, who is in Brussels. So, Alex, how likely is it now that the UK will compromise?
Well, there is a school of thought, Joe, which says that this is all a manufactured argument, that the reason that David Cameron's facing such opposition is that so when he comes out to Brussels to negotiate his final deal, he can go back to the UK and say, look, it was really tough, so therefore what I've managed to achieve is really worthwhile. But actually, I do think on this point, on welfare, there really is some genuine opposition. We've had a number of countries, Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, saying, look, we just don't agree with this proposal. And what we're now starting to hear from the government, I think, is exactly what they want on this. This morning, Philip Hammond, the Foreign Secretary, was in Brussels. He stopped and spoke to us on the way into a meeting of Foreign Affairs ministers, and his language suggested it might be time for compromise. This is what he had to say.
The 4-year waiting time for access to benefits has been a consistent demand from us. We've put that proposal on the table. It's very clear. And we've heard that a lot of our partners in Europe have concerns about it. So far, we haven't heard any counter-proposals. We haven't heard any alternative suggestions that will deliver the same effect in a different way. But we've made very clear that if people have other ideas that will deliver on this very important agenda for the British people, we're absolutely prepared to listen to them and we're prepared to enter into a dialogue about them. But at the moment, the only proposition on the table is our 4-year proposal. Thank you.
Philip Hammond there. Well, you're right, Alex. He does talk about other ideas. They'd be open to listening to other suggestions. What might those be?
Well, we've had a suggestion floated by Boris Johnson today. He points to the Danish model where there are some rules there which mean before you buy a property you have to meet residency criteria. One option being floated. The problem with that is it may require some change to domestic law and who's eligible for benefits in the UK. Another idea being kicked around is an emergency brake. So if the UK could show its public services were being overwhelmed, then there might be a possibility to limit the amount of migration. But again, question marks over who would decide, what the criteria would be, how you would activate that. Now, Downing Street at the moment saying that none of these are formal proposals that have been put forward. The only one that's being seriously considered is theirs on welfare, and that's still where the attention is focused. But as we know, European leaders meeting here later on this week to discuss all of this. What I think now is the bigger challenge is not just what David Cameron can get agreement on here in Brussels, but whether whatever he achieves on this point will be enough to satisfy those who've got concerns about the EU on the basis of immigration, i.e., will the outcome of this negotiation really make a difference in that referendum?
Alex Forsyth there in Brussels, and apologies for some of the technical difficulty on sound. Occasionally we have these problems, gremlins in the system. Anyway, we're joined now by the Conservative MP, Damian Green. Has renegotiation now turned into a meaningless exercise?
No, not at all, because there are 4 things the Prime Minister's asking for. This is one, and this is clearly the politically sensitive one. But there are other very important ones about making sure that even though we're not in the Eurozone and we're not going to join the Euro, that we have a fair crack at the single market as to all the other Eurozone out countries. There's protecting national parliaments, and there's removing the Britain's adherence to ever closer union. All of those are important. This is important as well.
Right, but it was a central part of the renegotiation, and the red line seemed to have been drawn by some of the other EU leaders. And now we've heard that actually it's going to do very little, according to the OBR, to actually cut levels of migration, which was the whole point of doing it.
It was part of the point was cutting numbers. The other part is there is a very strong feeling, which I share, that people shouldn't be able to come here and claim benefits from day one, or in particular, I think the one that really gets people is the idea of sending child benefit back to children who've never set foot in this country. And those are, if you like, the details at the heart of the negotiation.
But do you accept it's not actually going to have a particularly significant impact on levels of EU migration?
Well, we don't know. It's like all these things where you're looking ahead, you can't be sure what mix of motives there are.
Except in the manifesto, cutting EU migration will be an absolute requirement in the renegotiation, and it doesn't look as if it is going to deliver anything like what was first anticipated.
Well, I mean, we can't know that, but that's why I think the Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, is saying that if other people have got ideas to help us do this, then fine. But at the moment, the British government's idea is the only one on the table.
So the renegotiation continues.
Yeah, I mean, Damian's doing a very brave job here, but have you met anyone? Is anyone watching thinking, well, I'm undecided on this EU thing, but a 4-year moratorium on foreign benefits claims, that's the clincher for me? I mean, the truth is, instead of asking for meaningful changes in the location of sovereignty, the PM has drawn up a list of demands based not on what is in the UK national interest, but based on things that he knows he can get so that he's able to come back and declare victory. And I think it's really significant. If the EU is so intractable, so inflexible, unable to make significant concessions now, when its second largest economy is about to have a referendum on leaving, what would it be like after we had voted to stay? Imagine that we gave them that permission. We would then be utterly ignored and utterly taken for granted.
I mean, why is it the centrepiece of this renegotiation? The only people whom you know care very deeply about this politically are Tory MPs.
Well, you've declared
I'm not sure even they do.
You've declared it the centrepiece. It's one of.
No, I think Downing Street's made it the centrepiece, and Philip Hammond and David Cameron are talking about it as if it is the be-all and end-all.
Well, it's not the be-all and end-all.
Was it a tactical error to make it?
Well, no, I think. But the point is that I mean, where I don't agree with Dan is that he says that this whole renegotiation is a fraud. I don't think that's true. And I think the fact that actually there's a negotiation going on and that everyone hasn't just signed up and said, OK, fine, that's OK, you can have it, shows that this is a real negotiation, that actual real reforms are going to happen in Europe. And frankly, nothing the Prime Minister brought back would satisfy the sort of hard-line people who've always wanted to get out of the Europe.
Well, hang on.
David Owen set out a plan in the Times, a very moderate and reasonable plan for staying in the market aspects but opting out of the political ones. He's someone who left the Labour Party because it was insufficiently pro-EU. I would have happily gone for that, as I suspect most of your constituents, who are also my constituents, would have done. But for some reason, the PM didn't go for it.
Right. Well, why not?
Well, because the idea of that's pulling out of the EU. That's creating something that would put at risk the single market, the cooperation on security, the fact that Britain's voice in the world is louder because of our membership of the EU. I think putting all that at risk is what is actually going to be at the heart of the referendum campaign, which is not just going to be about the renegotiation. We agree on that.
So we're talking about the political institutions. We're all agreed that whatever the outcome of the referendum, we will stay in the single market. There won't be any tariffs. There's no tariffs for Iceland or for Turkey.
It's not for Britain to agree that. It's not our single market.
All right, but there is not a single other European country, whether or not it's in the EU or outside, that faces tariffs when selling to the EU except Belarus and Russia. So the idea that Britain, I mean, I don't think anyone in Brussels has ever
hang on, but these would have to be negotiated, and there are no guarantees in this world. It is true that there isn't anything that would keep Britain in the EU, either reformed or as it stands out, that you would ever support. I mean, that is the case.
That's really not true, Joe. I've written endless articles saying primacy of UK law, freedom to trade outside the EU. These are perfectly reasonable.
But it would mean Britain having to leave the EU. I'm not saying they're wrong, and I'm not saying they're moderate, but it would mean us having to leave.
We could have gone for those things in an amicable renegotiation. It is now
amicable, but not achievable within
those. It would have been achievable, but it's plainly not going to happen because it's not on the agenda.
No,
Therefore, the only way to get them is to vote to leave and then strike such a deal from the outside, because think of it from the point of view of the Eurocrats. When you know that the British Prime Minister is going to recommend his deal whatever, when you know he's going to campaign to stay in whatever, why make any concessions at all? They will save the concessions for after we vote to leave. That's when the real bargaining will begin.
Dan is clearly worried about the result of the referendum if he's already talking about what happens after.
I know what Brussels is like.
The central problem I have is this idea that you talk about the Eurocrats as though there is a body, a homogenous body of people in 27 other democratic, friendly countries, all of whom have exactly the same view of the world, and all of whom, for some peculiar reason which no Eurosceptic has ever been able to explain to me, wants to do Britain down. That is what's not true. There are no Eurocrats there who are a body comprising people from Greece to Germany to Scandinavia, all of whom have one view and all of whom want to do Britain down.
No one's ever suggested that they want to do Britain down. No one's ever suggested that they want to do Britain down, but they do
talk about it as a sort of
because
homogeneous.
what Angela Merkel says and what Jean-Claude Juncker says and so on is the same, which is we want to have a United States of Europe. We want more integration fiscally, economically, militarily, politically, and Britain has to decide, if we're not prepared to be part of what the EU is turning into, how do we negotiate a deal that will allow us market access without political union? Since it's not going to happen through these talks, we'll have to do it.
Well, let's talk about sovereignty, because moving away for a moment from the in-work benefits link, I mean, what else can really be achieved that is substantial, that is going to make a difference to, everyday people's lives? I mean, if you're talking about retaining national sovereignty, if you're not wanting ever closer union, and these are words just written down in documents, I mean, how is it going to be materially different to what we have now?
Well, what we have now, in many ways, is the best of all worlds. That we're a member of the single market, but we're not part of the Schengen deal. People are worried about our borders. We have control over our own borders. We don't belong to the euro, and it's clearly beneficial to Britain to have its own currency. This is a deal which is very good for Britain. What we want to do is reform Europe so that it gets better in itself. One of the other things we've not discussed at all is competitiveness. That sounds very general, doesn't it? I mean, that won't mean anything to the person down the pub, will it? Damian Green say we're going to reform this institution known as Europe to make it better. Better in what way? Well, better, for instance, in terms of security cooperation. I think what does matter, if you like, to people down the pub at the moment is that we live in an increasingly dangerous world. We've seen terrible events in Paris. Who knows when they're going to happen in some other European country. It is clearly sensible for us to have things like the European arrest warrant that allows us to chase terrorists quickly across borders. It's clearly sensible for us to sign up to a series of cooperation measures that the House of Commons voted for last week, which enable very quick exchange of DNA information of convicted criminals and terrorists. That's the kind of thing that the European Union gives us, that actually makes the streets of Britain safer, that we would put at risk if we left the EU.
Do you believe, Daniel Hannan, that legislating in the UK so that British as well as EU citizens must pay national insurance contributions for 4 years before they can claim in-work benefits is a viable and workable solution?
My guess is that is the government's fallback position.
Do you think that's what they're going to go for?
If they can't get the deal, but they may well get it. But I must come back on one thing. The reason that we're not in the euro is because Damian lost that argument. And like so many of the people who are now telling us...
that argument.
Oh, no, Damian, I remember having it with you at the time.
Let's not fight an argument that has been settled, really.
Important point, though, Joe, that the people... It's not just the same people. They're using exactly the same scare tactics. They said that if we didn't join the single currency, companies would relocate away from Britain and there'd be unemployment and so on. Thank heaven we didn't listen to them. They were wrong then, and they're wrong now.
What about this idea of in-work benefits? If you were to actually impose that on British workers for 4 years, then it would be accepted.
It would be accepted. I mean, you clearly have to look at the
sign up to that?
details
Would you agree to that if that's the deal?
I'd want to see the details. I mean, I think the government's current proposal is a better one than that. And it may be that somewhere out there somebody has a better idea to hit the underlying point about reducing migration.
Right, nothing so far. But would you sign up to a deal if the compromise is that actually British citizens will also be prevented from claiming in-work benefits for 4 years?
Well, as I say, it would depend on which. I think particularly with benefits, you do need to look at the detail. I think that the sort of broad brush approach doesn't work there. But there is a wider point that the benefits that we get in people's daily lives in terms of jobs and prosperity are what would be put at risk by our pulling out of the European Union. And that, I think, will be the actual heart of the referendum debate that we'll no doubt be having.
The real risk would be voting to stay. We've seen now that this is an organisation that will not reform. If we stay, we have the almost certainty of being dragged along to more deeper political and economic
And we'll continue this conversation over many, many months, since we don't yet know when the date is going to be for this referendum. Damian Green, thank you. He spent